Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. Well, we cover the markets and the finances and the scandals that are plaguing the global economy. It's a global game of poker in which the United States is holding the worst hand, a pair of jokers, Bernanke and Geithner. It's not going to win him much. Last week, I asked people to send me emails describing what to them represented peak America moments, because after all, revising GDP down again for the U.S. means we're getting at that point now where about ready to flush that country down. Let's bring in Stacy Herbert. Stacy Herbert.
Max, well, we had a great deal of response to your question, what was the peak America moment? I'm going to read you some. Dan H. says that America peaked in living standards in 1961. It was also the year of the heaviest car America ever produced, the 61 Lincoln Continental.
That's kind of interesting, actually, the heaviest car. Because I remember during Greenspan's era, he once said that Fed policy responds to the fact that the global economy had become lighter, that the amount of stuff in the container ships that were going around the world had lightened as the economy moved over to more electronic means of commerce and more exchange-traded commercial entities. And I believe that's probably correct, in that when the cars were at their heaviest was also at the same time, I believe, when American workers, adjusted for inflation, were being paid the most.
That's correct. He points out that the minimum wage was $1 then, which is over $10, the equivalent today.
Yep. See? I'm right again.
Another success story in America, of course, is Apple computers. And Zach says that peak America was when the relatively affordable Macintosh Plus came out.
Yeah, the Mac computer. This is an interesting story going forward because what's driven the sales of the iPad and the iPod over the past 12 months, Stacy, has been people who are walking away from their mortgages in America. Many people are just walking away and they're abandoning their mortgages, and they're rightfully so, because the banks who sold them the mortgages sold them under fraudulent inducement. And they're using the gain from not paying their mortgage to buy Apple products. Now, how long that can go on for? Well, I think there's another maybe 5 or 10 million people in America who should walk away from their mortgage and tell the banks to go stick it. So I would imagine sales of Apple stuff will continue to do well.
Well, I have one final one before we move on to the headlines. Greg W. says America's peak, February 2nd, 1959. I was 6, the day Buddy Holly and Richie Valens died in a plane crash. After that, people like Kennedy began to be killed by the New World Order.
Very interesting. Well, it was the end of a certain innocence of rock and roll, and it was the beginning of a much rawer, more guttural kind of leading up to the Rolling Stones, which, of course, are not American, are they?
But also correlation doesn't necessarily mean causality, and that's something that we see in the whole global deflationary spiral, the misunderstanding of the deflationary collapse by policymakers and central bankers around the world. So let's go on to this deflationary collapse in the headlines. OECD cuts global economic growth forecasts. According to the OECD, who in 2007, by the way, remember, said that they've never seen such benign conditions in the global economy, right? Well, now they're saying they're revising downward the G7 economies, the industrialized nations. They said that it's only going to grow 1.5% this year, not 1.75%. If it gets worse, they said that governments should introduce more quantitative easing and low interest rates.
Well, yes, that's, of course, at some point becomes impossible, without actually just admitting that the unit of currency that you're circulating is nothing more than toilet paper with some pictures of presidents or pretty pictures. And the OECD, of course, is a worthless organization. Their economic analysis and projections are almost uniformly worthless and incorrect. And if you listen to the smart people like we have on this show, later on I'll be talking to Steve Keen. Steve Keen is somebody, if you listen to, you would have sussed this out long ago.
Well, the OECD is filled with these neoclassical economists, so that what they're saying is basically more money printing, more destroying of the currency, more loading up of debt onto the taxpayer via the government. The government will buy the quantitative easing products from the banks, let the bankers get rich, destroy the savers and the taxpayers. So let's see what happens when you destroy the tax-paying people in the economy. Anglo-Irish Bank, exclamation point. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Ooh.
The most important bank in the world at this moment, according to Business Insider, which threatens to bankrupt the Irish state and destroy its relationship with the Eurozone, is seeing its credit default swaps blow out once again, up another 11% just today. So you can see from that chart, it's up, up, up. But what happened later that day? Ireland breaks up Anglo-Irish as EMU debt jitters return. So this is an article from the Telegraph, and they're saying why those the credit default swaps were surging on Anglo-Irish. The fear was that Dublin would do exactly what Iceland has done and walk away from the bad debts incurred by a few handful of bankers, in this case one bank, Anglo-Irish Bank, which is responsible for most of the bad debts in Ireland.
Ireland, walk away. Homeowners in America on your mortgages, walk away. Greece, walk away. Don't pay, walk away. Because these debts are fraudulently induced. They've got no obligation to pay these debts. It's absurd. Now, Ireland is just waking up to the fact that the NAMA, which was the bad bank, which is supposed to be somehow going to wash or launder all these bad debts in a way that's not highly detrimental to the general population, is a fraud. It's a scam. It's a huge slush fund. They just keep expanding those numbers of bad debts every quarter, and they say and no way to predict that these bad debts are going to increase. That's a lie. And, Iceland, Ireland, Greece are now going to join forces as part of the global insurrection against banking and corporate occupation.
Well, the article points out from Fintan O'Toole in the Irish Times, who's a well-known editorialist there. He said that the problem had become too big for Ireland to deal with after spending more than 25 billion euros. He said, quote, "The choice is now stark. Do we go on being good Europeans at the cost of destroying our own society, or do we become bad Europeans, lose the trust of our European partners, but save ourselves?" So you're saying they should save themselves. That's the answer.
Well, they don't want to be colonized by corrupt banking plantation owners who want to colonize the population of Ireland and Greece and Iceland with onerous, odious debt. People don't want to be colonized. They don't want to work on a plantation for corrupt bankers. And if they're not going to exert their freedom now, then forever hold your peace.
Well, of course, because of being a bad European equals being a bad peasant. And the definition of a bad peasant is one that rises up against the oligarch or, central power. Now let's look at what the alternative could be, what it would be like to be a bad peasant. Iceland won't settle IceSave dispute at any price. So this is Iceland's new economy minister, Arne Paul Arnesen, wants to make clear to the UK and Netherlands his government won't negotiate a depositor claim settlement at any price and may resort to the courts in pursuit of better terms.
There you go. Somebody's standing up to the banking oligarchs. Ireland, people of Greece, take a page out of this man's playbook. Stand up to your oligarchical slave masters.
Well, he's doing a good job. And, let's look at go to America, where where many trillions are on the Fed's balance sheet, therefore on the U.S. taxpayers' balance sheet. Now let's look at what they're what the headlines are saying the mood is there. 65% fear double dip. 71% say U.S. is fundamentally broken. Net 32% expect to reduce spending. So this is a Strategy 1 survey, and they find that 92% of Americans say the U.S. is still in recession. And this, of course, in an economy where 70% of the economy is consumer spending, is bad news. 57% of Americans are fearful of running out of money in the next year. And 44% say that if the American economy gets worse, they may go bankrupt.
No, it's a catastrophe. It's a depression. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, the media won't tell the people in America they're in a depression, so they're not taking remedies to get themselves out of a depression, and that's depressing. If
half of Americans, as the surveys say, are likely to go bankrupt in the next year, it doesn't bode well for all those people like China who own all those debts.
Oh, yeah. Well, China's loading up on Japanese debt now. So, they're hedging themselves, and they've got a lot of resources yet, a lot of cards to play.
Yeah, but Japan is the other zombie economy in the globe. China has a thing for zombies?
Oh, my God. It's a zombie world. Well, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
We're going to talk about more debt zombies right after this with Steve Keen in Australia. Don't go away. Hi, welcome back to the Keiser Report. Well, cometh the crisis, cometh the man. Time to head down under to Sydney, Australia, and talk with Professor Steve Keen. As well as being a professor, Steve Keen is the author of Debunking Economics. He also writes at his own blog, debtdeflation.com, and has just launched the Center for Economic Stability, an antidote to all those economic think tanks that delivered the global great deflation that we're all experiencing now. Steve Keen, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Good to be with you, Max.
All right, Steve Keen, what doesn't Ben Bernanke understand about deflation?
Where do I begin? Well, the best place is to say that he, like a lot of conventional economists and the vast majority even of some of the so-called Keynesian economists, he's living in a world in which debt is simply a transfer of saving power from one person to another. So if somebody goes into debt, it's because they've borrowed money from somebody else. The person they're borrowing can't spend as much. The person who borrowed can spend a bit more. And the only way you can get a crisis out of it in terms of a drop of aggregate demand is if the person who's borrowed actually spends a lot less money out of their income than the person who did the saving, which is unlikely. So that's a world in which you can't have the sort of a crisis we're having right now, which should alert Ben to what he doesn't understand, and that is that we don't live in a world where savings creates loans. We live in a world in which banks create loans and actually expand spending power by giving people a loan. And then if the banks cease extending those loans, or if people cease being willing to take them on, both of which are applying right now, the level of spending power can collapse and collapse very quickly. And that's the world that Ben Bernanke actually finds himself in.
Okay, so in other words, let's recap a little bit here. The model for banks for a long time has been this fractional reserve model where banks take deposits, then they lend out based on those deposits, and then those loans end up in other banks that make other loans, and you have this multiplicity effect, and you have the fractional reserve model. And at the end of the day, when you add it all up, there's still some reserves there in the banks. But what you're talking about here is that the loans that are being made are not based in any way on a fractional ratio to a reserve. The loans are simply made without any collateral whatsoever. And we're in a period now where the global banking system really, if you added up all the debt, you could say that has virtually no collateral. There is maybe 1/10 of a penny of collateral for every dollar made, but it's worthless in terms of any kind of accounting methodology you might use. Is that a kind of a fair statement?
Bit over the top, mate. I'll bring you back a couple of steps there. The basic story, though, is that banks, and this is said 40 or 50 years ago by a central bank economist in the States who was trying to understand the numbers, which just didn't make sense in terms of what's called the money multiplier model. And he said what happens is banks lend money, creating deposits by the very act of lending, and then go look for reserves later if they actually need the reserves to justify what they've already lent out. So the act of creating a loan actually creates a matching deposit at the same time. The reason you're right about saying that there's, collateral's not worth a tuppenny out there for all the debt is that a lot of that money banks have lent hasn't actually been to provide what banks should be doing, which is giving working capital to firms. or even largely giving people money to buy houses to live in. It's been used to gamble on rising asset prices. And you get a positive feedback loop between the amount of money banks are willing to lend and the amount of people willing to gamble on asset prices, which drives up asset prices and means the banks lend yet more money. And it's actually created a huge pound of assets that balance the liabilities, but only if you're an idiot who believes the valuations the banks put on the houses in the first place. So it's a house of cards they've financed, but the fundamental way they've behaved is the way banking has always behaved. Banks create money by issuing loans. And if we continue believing the savings myth, we'll never understand how we can have a collapse in demand caused by banking drying up as it's happening now.
Right. Now, just to keep on this theme a little bit, there's been a growing trend in the banking industry of really treating their customers with contempt. Let me make a little bit of an analogy here. In the Middle East countries, let's take Saudi Arabia, they don't give their citizens a lot of rights because they don't need their citizens. They don't need them to produce jobs, to produce taxes, to fund the government because they've got all that oil wealth. Now, let's talk about America for a second and the banking system. Because these banks can go onto this, what is called the wholesale deposit market, the wholesale derivative market, they can create pseudo-deposits and respect international reserve requirements by, let's say, the BIS. But effectively, they don't need those retail deposits anymore. They don't need retail people. They don't need people to save money. This is why the only message you get from economists and politicians in America is for people to just borrow and spend money because they don't need their deposits to create a banking system. They can create fake deposits. Now, when the credit collapse started in 2007, what happened was that the fact that these banks have buttressed themselves with basically fake assets, fake reserves, or mortgages tied to house prices that were completely unsustainable, then we see suddenly the emperor has no clothes, and there's no there. So talk a little bit about real estate prices and mortgages, because still the banks around the world are carrying a real estate collateralized paper tied to real estate valuations, which for the most part are pretty fictitious. Would you say that is true?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what the banks it added to the demand in the economy by expanding debt levels. So the amount of money being spent in the economy on everything, on goods and houses, existing houses and new houses as well, and shares as well, was the sum of the income we earn, which is our GDP, plus the increase in debt. And while the banks were pumping out more and more debt, the economy appeared to be booming and asset prices were rising. And that's what gave us the whole bubble. The so-called Great Moderation was actually the Great Financialization. But of course, when you get to the stage where people are carrying so much debt that the individuals have to service and suddenly find they haven't got the cash flow anymore and they stop borrowing the money, then the banks go from expanding debt to actually contracting debt. And America's actually reducing its debt level now, the private debt, at the rate of about $2 trillion a year. That's sucking $2 trillion worth of spending our money out of the economy. And, of course, when that comes down, so do asset prices, because the prices are really fictional. The prices are based on leverage and relying on the next person borrowing more money than you did to buy the place off you. When that stops, the house price goes into reverse, but, of course, the money you owe is still owed. So you're left with the debt, but you haven't got the asset prices collapse, and that's the great dilemma America's in, has been for the last 3 years, and it's going to be there for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so what you're describing there is a very articulate way of describing a Ponzi scheme. Now, a Ponzi scheme requires new money coming in continuously to feed the cash outs from the people who came early into the Ponzi scheme. You're saying that the GDP number, which includes debt, masks the fact that you have an ever-expanding debt burden which is being foisted onto the population, which can be serviced as long as the asset values, which are being used as collateral to fund more debt, are also marked up. And they're marked up aggressively by the banks, who, we know now, marked them up based on their quantitative analysis and other tricks, which amounted to basically market manipulation. And now that this has peaked, It's all running in reverse. The Ponzi scheme has now come to a close, like the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. Nobody is adding any more fresh credit into the Ponzi scheme, and there is no fresh credit to come into the Ponzi scheme because jobs are evaporating, asset prices are deteriorating. There's absolutely no way, Steve Kane, am I correct? There's absolutely no way, there's nothing any policymakers can do to get the inflation started again at this point, is there?
No, I think that's the trouble. They're trying, just as they don't understand how debt actually grows and causes demand to expand faster than incomes alone during a boom, they also don't understand the mechanism that causes inflation, because they think all they've got to do is put a bit of money in, the private sector will multiply that money by a factor of 10 using fractional banking, and they'll get inflation that way. Well, Ben Bernanke tried that. He literally doubled the base money supply in 4 months back in 2008. But it did cause a small amount of inflation. It bumped prices from falling at 2% per annum to rising at 2% per annum for a short while. But now you're back in deflation again. So they don't understand the system. They don't have the armory needed to turn the system around. And as a result, you're likely to see deflation continuing and deleveraging continuing, and you'll be caught in a pretty much permanent slump until the debt's drastically reduced. But they're doing very little to actually actively reduce it. They should be abolishing the debt, because my good mate Michael Hudson says so well, debt that can't be repaid won't be repaid. What you've got to work out is how you're not going to repay it. They're still trying to make people pay debt that should never have been issued in the first place, and that's a recipe for a continuing depression.
Okay, so monetary policy can't bring back inflation. Fiscal policy, the bailouts and the work programs, that can't bring back inflation. So we're left in this deflationary, self-feeding vortex in countries, let's go to Europe for a second, in countries like Iceland, Ireland, and now in Greece. They're coming to the same conclusion that Michael Hudson has come to. As a matter of fact, he's been in Eastern Europe preaching this message about you can't, debts get paid off if they can't get paid off. These countries are now saying, you know what, we're going to walk away from our debts. In Ireland, in Greece, in Iceland, in Eastern Europe, they're just walking away from the debt, like millions of homeowners in America are walking away from their debt. Does that make, I mean, that seems like the only recourse, and the sooner you do it, the better off you're going to be. Yeah,
and the people who should wear the pain for all this are the bankers. They're the ones who didn't actually realize they were relatives of Bernie Madoff. They thought they deluded themselves to believe what they were doing was actually sensible banking, when you're quite right, all they were doing was financing an elaborately disguised Ponzi scheme. And now, of course, they want us to continue paying the Ponzi debts they ran up. Well, basically, we should tell them to bugger off. If they lent money they shouldn't have lent, they should fold, they should go bankrupt, the debt shouldn't be honoured, and the financial system should collapse. And it should be the banks that go down with it, and we maintain the payment system behind that, nationalise the buggers in the meantime. They've got no right to hang on to the private assets they accumulated in the process. That's all necessary to happen. But the political shift that involves, I think, is a long way from happening in America right now. It may happen in Europe a lot earlier because, of course, they're feeling the pain of this deleveraging and the public sector cutting back as well, more earlier than the Americans are doing.
Does the European Central Bank have a better handle on deflation? I mean, their mandate has been to fight inflation, particularly since the experience of the Bundesbank and the Reichsmark during the hyperinflated 1920s and so. But did they have a better handle on deflation?
No, I don't think they do. I think they've got a stronger social contract than America has, and that's going to reduce the downward pressure caused by private sector deleveraging to some extent. But if they go and put that in reverse, which, some people are arguing they should abolish, they should cut back government deficits dramatically. Because they haven't done that, they're probably sustaining demand better than the Americans are doing right now. But there's still no real awareness there. I mean, there's an easy way to cause inflation, and this is heresy for economists: increase wages.
Yeah.
That's what they should be doing. Put wages up dramatically. That would cause inflation because the firms would be forced to pass the costs on that way. You'd get inflation quite quickly. But because economists are so anti-manipulating the labour market, except they're trying to depress wages and make workers worse off, that's the last thing they'll do. But that's quite a simple method that could cause inflation virtually overnight and start reducing those debt levels, increase wages, because, frankly, it's the workers who've paid for the extra debt, not the capitalists. And they're the ones who should be getting the recompense, not the capitalists, and certainly not the bankers.
Yeah, certainly. And the workers and the retirees are paying for the bankers' crimes as well by not getting any return on their savings.
That's right. So the bankers the bankers should suffer the pain, and the easy way to get if they're going to find an easy way to cause inflation, it's to mandate an increase in money wages and then let part of that be passed on as inflation, but only part of it, and you cause an inflationary surge and reduce the debt levels that way. But of course, that's the last thing our governments are ever going to do.
All right, speaking of, let's say, high name recognition economists, Joseph Stiglitz would have to be in your book probably on debunking economics, but he is saying that austerity cutbacks in Europe are, quote, going to be an economic disaster. Your thoughts, Steve Keen?
I think he's right. If they had, you can look at the monetary system has got two components to it. There's money created by the private credit system, which has been out of control, as we know, and that's caused the bubble. There's money the government can create as well, and the government, frankly, hasn't been doing enough of that for a long time. Now, if you have a private sector cutting back and deleveraging, that's reducing cash flow in the economy. If the government goes and does the same thing at the same time, you've got basically two banks shutting down on you rather than one, and that'll make it more severe. So on that particular front, Joe's quite right. The last thing you need when there's private sector austerity is to throw public sector austerity on top of it. We should be attacking the private debt, but we shouldn't be driving down spending on top of the reduction the private sector itself is already causing.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have this week. Steve Keen, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
You're welcome, mate. Good to talk.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Steve Keen. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.